Let me now give the floor to Ayush so that we can take a more global pictures of the key pillars of TCFD.
Thank you, Olivier, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So before we dive into the outputs we produce for TCFD reporting, I wanted to spend a few minutes on looking at what are the recommended disclosures under the TCFD framework and how we help address each of these. So the table that we see here shows 3 out of the 4 pillars that TCFD recommends disclosures on. I'm sure a lot of us have seen this table in the TCFD documentation. So today we will be focusing on strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The color of the boxes that you see to the right indicates which corresponding disclosures each of these relate to. So let's start with the first pillar of strategy. Here, the TCFD recommends an organization to describe what climate-related risks and opportunities they have identified for their business in the short, medium, and long term. How will these risks or opportunities impact their business? And finally, how resilient their business is under different climate-related scenarios. So let's focus on the yellow box on the top right. We help our clients address these disclosure requirements in a couple of ways. Firstly, we help them identify the climate-related transition and physical risks. We then help quantify how these would have a financial impact, which is measured in terms of impact on operating profit margins, an increase in operating expenses, and any losses incurred on asset value due to extreme weather. We then go further and test the resilience of the business and its ability to absorb future financial shocks due to transition or physical risks across 3 climate scenarios and short, medium, and long-term time horizons, all the way up to the middle of the century. I would like to point out that the scenarios that we use are credible, they're science-based, and they are taken from well-recognized scientific bodies and think tanks. On the flip side of these risks lie transition opportunities, which we help organizations identify as well as they look to make their businesses more future-proof. If we look at the third pillar here, which is metrics and targets, and if we zoom in on the purple-colored boxes and we look at the first recommended disclosure, which is around metrics which are used by an organization to assess climate-related risks. So we help our clients report certain key financial metrics that tie into these different climate-related risks. For example, we help calculate the carbon price risk exposure, which is reflective of future policy risks. We also calculate EBITDA at risk for key customers or suppliers, which help assess how revenues or supply chains may be impacted due to carbon pricing. And this reflects market risk. For technology risk, we assess how much of a company revenue may be derived from business activities that are candidates for a low carbon transition. And finally, we help derive financial risk to asset values, which can be attributed to physical risk or extreme weather events. If we look at the second disclosure requirement under metrics and targets, which is reporting different scopes of GHG emissions, this is another area where we help our clients calculate their carbon inventory, not just across their own operations, but also across their supply chain or value chains. And finally, if we look at the third recommendation, which is around setting targets, this is another area where we help our clients establish their emission reduction targets, which are aligned with the methodology of the SBTi or the Science Based Targets Initiative. Last but not least, if we look at the risk management column, which is to the middle of the table, now, all of the risk identification, quantification, and the stress testing that we have done under the 2 pillars, the 2 other pillars, then feeds into our clients' overall risk management frameworks. So hopefully this gives us all a good overview into how we work alongside organizations to help them find an alignment with these different TCFD recommended disclosures. And in the upcoming slides, I will take a closer look at each of these areas we just discussed using some visuals as well. So next slide, please. Okay, so even before we start exploring different ways of fulfilling these climate reporting requirements, it's a good idea to assess where we stand today and identify any possible gaps that might exist against the TCFD recommended disclosures. So this is where we help our clients who are in early stages of their reporting journey. Going by the results of the quiz that Olivier shared earlier, it does seem like quite a significant proportion, so 65% of the organizations are still in their early stages. So while conducting such a gap analysis, we review the publicly available disclosures. These could be sustainability reports or CDP questionnaires of our clients, and also up to 3 of their peers, to evaluate their current disclosure against the 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. We then produce a disclosure alignment score so that our clients can not only assess which of the pillars need more work, but also compare their current reporting with those of the peers as well. So if we look at the illustration on the right, we can see which of the 4 pillars are subject company, which is indicated in the solid yellow line, has a good and a not so good alignment with. Similarly, we can see the percentage of alignment against the 4 pillars for each of the 3 comparators as well. So it is clear in this case that there is scope for improvement in the strategy and the metrics and targets related disclosures for our subject company. So to summarize, this is a good exercise to identify areas of reporting where we need to put more efforts to close any current gaps. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's dive deeper into the transition risks, and I will start with the company level transition risk first. The first transition risk that I want to touch on is the risk due to policy changes. So the key risk factor being assessed here is the carbon price risk and its possible impact on a company's operating costs, and consequently the impact on its operating profit margins. So in this table, we can see the projected carbon price risk in millions of dollars. It has been broken down by scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 can be analyzed similarly as well. And we are testing 3 carbon price scenarios. So we're testing low carbon price, moderate carbon price, and high carbon price. And for 2 time periods, a more near-term 2025 and a longer-term 2050. So the impact of carbon price risk on the company's OPEX and also the profit margins has been shown in the last 2 rows of the table that you see here. The charts show us these risks on a time series and across the 3 scenarios. So the chart on the left reflects how carbon price risk will trend in the future years and under these different scenarios. And the chart on the right shows how the operating profit margin might be impacted due to carbon pricing in future years and under these different carbon price scenarios. So all these financial metrics help us understand the risks related to policy changes as the world transitions to a low carbon economy. And we help our clients calculate an internal carbon price, which then feeds into their future financial planning decisions, or more broadly, any strategic decision making as well. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so market risk. What we help assess here is the possible impact of carbon price on the earnings of a company's key customers or suppliers. So the 2 charts show the EBITDA at risk for a company's top customers, both from a sectoral as well as an individual customer view. On the left, we can see that the subject company derives largest revenues from customers in the oil and gas sector. The revenue is indicated by the little pink dot that you see on the chart. And these oil and gas customers are exposed to a reasonably high EBITDA at risk due to carbon pricing under this high carbon price scenario that we have selected. So as these customers face increased pressure due to future carbon pricing, there's possibly increased risk on the company's revenues, which are coming from such customers in the future. If we look at electric utilities as the customer segment, so expectedly, electric utilities will face the highest EBITDA at risk due to high carbon pricing being applied to them. The subject company fortunately has low revenue exposure to customers in this industry. The chart on the right and the table below further decomposes this risk on a customer level, helping us identify which of our key customers are at the most risk of their earnings being impacted due to carbon price. So in this case, we can see that customers 2, 3, and 4 clearly show an above average impact on their EBITDA compared to the industry sectors that they belong to. The same analysis can be done for a company's top suppliers as well, in order to understand any possible implications of increased pass-through costs, which may come from suppliers who are getting impacted by carbon pricing in the future. So in conclusion, this type of analysis can help an organization ascertain the climate-related market risks as identified by the TCFD and get ahead of any revenue losses or higher sourcing costs that may arise in the future. Next slide, please. And finally, we will take a look at reputation risk. So the TCFD identifies stakeholder concern or negative stakeholder feedback as examples of climate-related reputation risk. Now, such reputation risks have the potential to impact talent attraction or retention, long-term customer relationships, the license to operate, or access to capital. So as part of this analysis, we help organizations perform a peer analysis on how they compare against each other on the basis of their carbon intensities, the climate strategy and related disclosures, and alignment of their current and projected emissions with the Paris Agreement. So if you look at the charts, these charts show our subject company and its peers side by side. And what we are displaying here is the company's business as usual emissions, which are shown with the solid line in the charts, and where these emissions need to be in order to be aligned with a 2-degree or a well below 2-degree Paris-aligned emissions pathway. That pathway has been shown using the dashed and dotted lines in the chart. So in this particular example, we can see that while the peers are doing quite well, their emissions are much below the Paris-aligned trajectories. Unfortunately, our subject company is falling behind, especially when you look at the solid line after 2022. Then in the table below, we can see the other components which are used to calculate an overall reputation risk score. So these components reflect a company's relative carbon intensity, the quality of their climate strategy disclosures, and the level of their emissions alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So by undertaking such a reputation risk assessment, we walk away with insights on how we stack up against our competitors and where we need to put efforts in order to maintain positive stakeholder relationships. Okay, so next slide, please, Olivier.
Thanks a lot, Ayush. Actually, we thought when we prepared this webinar that it'd be useful for the audience to actually take a brief pause at this moment to illustrate, what we've been saying from the Ayush's perspective with an actual case study of a client we have been working with for a TCFD report. So a very good example is Samsung SDI, which is a manufacturer and distributor of rechargeable batteries used for electric vehicle, IT, energy storage system, and so on, which is based in South Korea and obviously part of the Samsung Electronics Group. So, Ayush, one of the key questions that we wanted I wanted to ask you, as we want to give a concrete example is, first, why did the client decide to publish a TCFD report?
So the main reason or the most important trigger for this client was requests from their overseas investors and also their customers who wanted to better understand what Samsung SDI's climate-related risks are. And also, the client's battery business is very closely linked to policies on climate change. So they themselves wanted to properly assess what opportunities or risks lie ahead of them.
Okay. And thank you for this. And as you've been working with them, how could you let us know which of the TCFD insights that they have come across that have been most valuable to their business?
Sure. So the client mentioned that the assessment of financial risks, that was something which they found particularly useful in setting the direction for their medium to long-term GHG strategies. And also, they particularly leveraged our findings to decide on what future renewable energy expansion schemes they should undertake as well.
Okay, okay, thank you. And earlier I'm going back to what I was saying in my introduction that TCFD is a journey, and usually a journey is better traveled, not alone, but as a group. And what we see is that it's often also an occasion, publishing and going through this TCFD journey to engage employees in that process. Could you let us know a bit more about how the client engaged company employees through the process and through the findings of the TCFD?
Yes, and that's a great point. So in fact, the client did go on to establish a GHG function within their planning team and gave them the mandate to oversee all GHG related work across the organization. And that said, the client also planned to make wider organizational changes, both at the division as well as the factory level, where, of course, it was appropriate.